Hi, I'm Tori, and today I'm going to be discussing Nation by Terry Pratchett. This book was published in 2008, and I listened to the audiobook narrated by Stephen Briggs. So I love Discworld, and I love that whole universe that Terry Pratchett has created, but this is the first book of his I've read set outside of Discworld, apart from Good Omens, which he co-wrote. So this is the first book that he wrote on his own that isn't in Discworld, and it still had a lot of his same humor, but it was interesting to see in a context that wasn't a fantasy story, and it was more just kind of historical alternate fiction. So this book takes place in a parallel universe that is very similar to ours in maybe the 17 or 1800s. It takes place on a tropical island, and it opens with a massive tsunami that just devastates the island and leaves a ship stranded there that contains a girl who came from England. Her name is Daphne, and she and Mao, a boy from the island, are the last two people left, and they have to kind of piece their lives back together and figure out what matters about society and how they're going to move on from here. I am going to start discussing the book, so if you want to read it, I highly recommend that you go do that, then come back to hear my opinions. So the most interesting thing about this story to me was the way that it challenged people's views of society, but also stuck with a lot of societal norms, and the way that the characters kind of struggled against the beliefs that they'd grown up with, but then sort of settled back into those beliefs and realized that they were there for a reason. I did think it was an interesting choice that Mao, the person from a culture very different from the authors and probably different from most of the readers, is the one who had to challenge his religious views, while Daphne didn't really even think about her religious views. She looked at the etiquette she'd grown up with and things like that, but it didn't really challenge Western religion at all. It was only challenging the islanders' native religion, and Western religion wasn't really a topic that they considered. And the story presented Mao's journey of kind of figuring out what his religious beliefs were in such an interesting way, because he started out, firmly believing in his gods. Then the tsunami came and he lost all faith in everything he'd ever been taught. And then as the story went on and he met more and more people who stuck by their religion despite evidence against it, he realized that even if you don't believe in religion, it does still serve purposes, and you can get good things out of religion. He learned it was passing on knowledge and kind of giving people hope and something to believe in. So even if he didn't actually believe that the religion was true, it still mattered and it was still important to his people. And then Mao was pushing a lot of boundaries. He was being chief even though he had not finished the ceremony to become a man. So he was still considered a boy, and he was still believed not to have a soul because he hadn't gone through all the steps he was supposed to, but he was still pushing that. And he was fighting against his religious beliefs and trying to change a lot of things culturally. But then he still stuck with a lot of the kind of norms that were expected of him. He was still the man leading this nation and doing physically dangerous things and being physically strong. And then Daphne didn't help him with leading at all. She was the one who was there to support him. And her role was to heal him when he got sick and help him see better perspective so that he could then help rule the society, the nation that they were building. And they didn't really challenge any of those entrenched beliefs that they both had, that the men were the one who ruled and the women were the one who supported the men. And it would have been so much more interesting to me if Daphne were a protagonist too, because she wasn't really. She was just kind of the love interest and support for Mao. And it was much more Mao's journey than Daphne's. It was supposed to be kind of evenly divided between them, but it felt like it still skewed more toward him. And it felt like as long as they were tearing apart their societies and questioning their beliefs, they could have pushed a lot harder and changed a lot more things. It was also really interesting what was culturally significant to each group of people, because Mao's society just kind of cared about their traditions, their way of life, and that they were things that Daphne's society would not have cared about at all. And Mao would have, and his whole nation that he built would have been completely obliterated by the end of the book. But they had discovered that in the past, they had made all these scientific discoveries that were actually of cultural significance to Daphne's people. So it was almost like this history of the nation was just kind of like, oh, it's an interesting footnote, but it was only useful to the nation in that it would give them credibility in the eyes of Daphne's society. And it let Mao and his society just kind of continue on as they would have. And because they had this history, it kind of gave them the ability to have a say and fight against or stand up to Daphne's society. And so it was really interesting to kind of see the things that the two different groups of people valued. And then the ending of the book was fascinating to me because it set off this whole like branching timeline that it could have been our world pretty much up until the end of the book. And then they come up with this thing where the nation is going to join the scientific academies and gain credibility. And from there, they become this like seat of knowledge and learning, even though it's all things that were lost to them. And, you know, all through Mao's lifetime, he had no recollection of any of this, but because his ancestors knew all this, it became this like seat of learning. And I love that bit at the ending where they talk about all the scientists who had come. They started with Charles Darwin and they went off, they threw Feynman in there, just like, so you could see as the book ended, like pretty much modern day. And all of these scientists had come to this small little island nation that had become this great like seat of learning. And I was almost more fascinated by that story. I wish there had been a sequel where we could have seen this world that would have sprung up, where the traditions and culture of Mao's nation was preserved, but then we had all this science and learning that was valued by the more Western cultures mixed in. So I thought this book asked a lot of really interesting questions. It was still funny, not quite as funny as like a Discworld book, but that may just be because I'm more comfortable in Discworld, and this was kind of a more serious tone to it than most of the Discworld stories. I really liked the questions it asked, but I thought it could have pushed harder, it could have pushed more boundaries, and just kind of questioned things more. And I thought even though it was trying really hard to present both cultures as equally valid, it still skewed, I thought, a little bit too much in favor of the westernized culture, and that it treated the nation more like ignorant children and the westernized cultures, the grown-up, mature ones, and it could have just done a little bit better job of that. But overall, I still really enjoyed this book, and Terry Pratchett is amazing no matter what world he is writing in.